Hello, welcome back to Kim Reads as we continue with Pride and Prejudice. Chapter 17, Visit to Pemberley. Elizabeth, who was not interested in going to Brighton, used the time to study her own family. She was forced to admit that her parents did not have a very happy marriage. Her father had been captivated by youth and beauty and had married a woman with a weak mind and selfish heart. Thus, early in marriage, he had lost all real affection for her. Respect, esteem, and confidence had vanished. All of his hopes for marital happiness were lost. He took solace in nature and his books. His wife and her foolish ideas did not interest him. Even as she despaired of her parents, Elizabeth rejoiced over Wickham's departure. But at home there was constant complaining. To keep her spirits up, she eagerly accepted an invitation from the Gardiners to travel with them. The next week, the Gardiners arrived in Longbourn to pick up Elizabeth and head north for Derbyshire. Elizabeth was excited and curious. Wouldn't it be possible to see the great houses of Derbyshire without seeing Darcy and his Pemberley? Off to the trio went through Oxford, Warwick, and Birmingham. When they finally arrived at the little town of Lambden, they stopped to explore all the wonders of the countryside. Her aunt, a native of Derbyshire, expressed a desire to see Pemberley again. "My dear, would you like to see a place you have heard so much about?" asked her aunt. "Wickham spent his youth there, you know." Elizabeth was very distressed. She felt she had no business at Pemberley, now that she had refused Mr. Darcy's offer of marriage, but her aunt insisted. "The grounds are delightful, and has some of the finest woods in the country." Elizabeth said no more. The possibility of meeting Mr. Darcy haunted her. It would be dreadful. She blushed at the very idea, but she was afraid to speak openly to her aunt. Thus to Pemberley they would go. Elizabeth, as they drove along, watched for the first appearance of Pemberley woods with some nervousness. By the time they had reached the lodge, she had butterflies in her stomach. They had entered the grounds in one of the lowest points and drove for some time through a beautiful wood stretched over a wide extent. Elizabeth's mind was much too full for conversation, but she saw and admired every remarkable spot and point of view. Then her eye was caught by the Pemberley house, situated on the side of a valley framed by a winding road. It was a large, handsome stone building, and backed by a ridge of high woody hills. In front of the house was a stream. Elizabeth was delighted. She had never seen an estate where nature had been so neatly enhanced by the architecture. She and her relatives were all warm in their admiration. At the moment she felt to be the mistress of Pemberley would be something. They descended the hill, crossed the bridge, and drove to the other door, her fears of meeting its owner returned. On asking for a tour of the house, they waited for the housekeeper to show them around. The housekeeper came, a respectable-looking elderly woman. The rooms were lofty and handsome, and their furniture suitable to Darcy's considerable fortune. Elizabeth had to admire his taste. There was less splendor and more elegance at Rosings. And of this place, thought she, I might have been the mistress. With these rooms, I might have been familiarly acquainted. Instead of viewing them as a stranger, I might have enjoyed them as my own, and welcomed my aunt and uncle as my visitors to this great house. Mr. Gardiner, whose manners were easy and pleasant, encouraged the housekeeper to talk. Mrs. Reynolds, either from pride or attachment, took great pleasure in talking of her master and his sister. "Is your master much at Pemberley and in the course of the year?" Mr. Gardiner asked. "Not so much as I would wish, sir." "If your master would marry, you might see more of him," Mr. Gardiner hinted. "Yes, sir, but I do not know when that will be. I do not know who is good enough for him." Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner smiled at the housekeeper's pride in Darcy. "I have never had a cross word from him in my life, and I have known him ever since he was 4 years old." There was some praise that conflicted with Elizabeth's own ideas. She long believed that he was not a good-tempered man. She longed to hear more. "He is the best landlord, and the best master," said Mrs. Reynolds proudly. "Not like the wild young men nowadays who think of nothing but themselves. There is not one of his tenants or servants who would not speak well of him. Some people are calling him proud, but I'm sure I never saw any of that. To my fancy, it's only because he does not rattle away like other young men. This puts him in a much better light, thought Elizabeth. This is a fine account of him, whispered her aunt as they talked. It is not quite consistent with his behavior to Wickham. Perhaps we have been deceived, Elizabeth whispered back. If only they knew. After all, Elizabeth thought the praise bestowed on him by Mrs. Reynolds was of no small nature, but praise is more valuable than the praise of an intelligent servant. As a brother, a landlord and master, she considered how many people's happiness was in his hands, how pleasure or pain it was his power to bestow. When all of the house that was open to the general public was seen, they were taken on a tour of the grounds by a gardener who met them at the door. As they walked across the lawns towards the river, Elizabeth turned back and looked at Pemberley once more. Suddenly, Darcy appeared on the road behind the stables. She had instinctively turned away, but turned back as he spoke to her. Elizabeth blushed deeply. Neither of them were at ease. Her aunt and uncle, who had been walking with the gardener, returned. They both commented on the handsome figure Darcy made as he walked away. Elizabeth, for her part, was overpowered by emotion. Her coming here, she suspected, was the worst idea in the world. That he should even speak to her was amazing, and to speak as he did, she realized he had never spoken to her with such gentleness. If only she knew what he was thinking. Did he still love her? Elizabeth kept her thoughts to himself. When her relations wanted to continue to talk, she nodded in agreement. While wondering in the slow, lazy manner, they were again surprised. Mr. Darcy was good approaching them. Elizabeth admired his good manners to match politeness. She complimented on the beauty of Pemberley. Mrs. Gardiner was standing a little behind her niece. Darcy asked if Elizabeth would do the honor of introducing him. She would hardly suppress a smile at his wanting to meet some of the very people his pride had revolted against earlier. The introduction, however, was immediately made. When she told that the Gardiners were her aunt and uncle, it was clear he was pleased by the connection. He responded with great courtesy and began speaking to Gardiner. Liz could not help but be happy, ever triumphant. It was important to her for him to know that she had relatives she was proud of. The conversation soon turned to fishing. Please feel free to fish on my property as much as you like while you visit Derbyshire, Darcy said. I will be happy to provide you with all necessary equipment. Elizabeth said nothing, but I understand the invitation was clearly a compliment to her. Why, she wondered, can he still be in love with me? Mrs. Gardiner, tired from her walk, soon turned to her husband for support. Mr. Darcy walked beside Elizabeth, and after a short silence, Elizabeth spoke. She wanted him to know that she assumed he would not be at home, and that she was surprised by his appearance. He explained that business had been the reason for his early arrival. In a few hours, his friends, Mr. Bingley and his sisters, would join him. There was one other person in the party, he continued after a pause, who wants to meet you. May I introduce you to my sister during your stay here? I'd be most pleased to meet her, she said, happily that he did not think badly of her as she had feared. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner were invited into the house for refreshments. They declined with the utmost politeness. Mr. Darcy handed the ladies into the carriage. When they drove off, Elizabeth saw him walking slowly towards the house. He is perfectly well-behaved, polite, and unassuming, said her uncle. There is something a little stately about him, replied her aunt. But though some people may call him proud, I see nothing of it. Why did you tell us he was so disagreeable, Lizzie? Her uncle asked. Elizabeth excused herself, explaining that she had never seen him as pleasant as he was that morning. She felt she should say something to explain his true treatment of Wickham. So she told him that the reliable sources had informed her that his actions toward Wickham were the most honorable kind. Mrs. Gardner was surprised and concerned, but said nothing. Elizabeth was too amazed by the day's events to say more. All she could think of was Darcy and his wish that she meet his sister. What could that mean? Okay, that is the end of that chapter. See you later.